Welcome back again. We're going to talk about beginning drawing. And before we can do that, we really need to understand some of the basic navigation and layout manipulations. So first, we need to make sure that before we draw, Duct Quote knows what type of material or product line we're going to draw with. I'm going to start with the US Duct rolled lip product. And I'm going to arbitrarily pick 6 inches as a starting diameter. Now, it's important that you keep in mind, Duct Quote can automatically size the duct for you later, but we'll get more into that in a minute. So some basic controls. Your scroll wheel on your mouse allows you to zoom in or zoom out to your layout. If I left click and drag, I can spin my layout around all 3 axes of space. If I right click and drag, I can move it through a single plane at one time so that I have a little bit more control of what it is that I'm looking at. So with that in mind, what we have to do first to begin drawing is to have a starting point. So I'm going to put Duct Quote in point mode here at the top right. And you'll see as I bring the cursor onto the grid, I get the X that's in red and Z coordinates for this grid, and it reads out as I move my cursor around. So I'm going to start with something way back here in the corner, and I'm going to click once to set the starting point on the floor. And I'm then going to start to move my cursor up the green vertical axis, that's the Y-axis here, and I'm going to take this up to about 10 feet. And there we have 10 feet. If I click a second time, I have set a starting point. And if I put myself in draw mode and hover over that starting point, you can see I get a green box with crosshairs. I also get the 3-dimensional coordinates of that starting point. Now, in draw mode, once we've selected the appropriate materials, if I click once while on that starting point with the green box, you'll see I get guidelines. And if I move my cursor along these guidelines, you can see that duct is being drawn. So I'm going to draw this out to here, and I can even type in a distance, as you see at the top, type length. Well, I'm going to type in 60 inches and hit the Enter key. Hitting the Enter key finishes the actual insertion of a section of duct. Now take note, if I hover over both ends where I have points, both of these are recognized as starting points. So I could draw duct from either end here. But it's also important to take note that here with these red arrows, Duct Quote is indicating the airflow in this piece of duct. This section has airflow from left to right. Now, that's because the first assumption Duct Quote makes about airflow is that the very first section of duct created or drawn in a layout is assumed to be in the direction. The direction that you draw is assumed to be the direction of airflow. If this is not the case and we want to change that, we simply go into edit mode. I click once on that section. You see it highlighted in yellow. And now these double arrows circling each other can switch the direction. And as you can see now, the arrows are going in the other direction. Okay? So back in draw mode, if I wanted to draw another piece, I can either pull this along and you'll see a 4th number labeled L, that's the length. And you can see that that is reading off for me how far I've gone. Again, if I know the distance, I can type it in, say 120 inches. Gives me twice the distance. Now you'll note I have a starting point at the far left, a starting point at the far right, and because I stopped and started, I've got a starting point there in the middle. So if I wanted to change directions, again, from this starting point, I could follow, say, the blue line and come down. I could even turn and go up the green line. And we could continue turning. And you can see that at this point, Duct Quote is putting in all of the elbows that we need. And that's because we have everything lined up according to the flow. All right. So one other thing, if I needed to make a branch, I could make a branch here because I now have a starting point in the middle. We're going to talk about branches a little bit more later on, but as you can see, starting or stopping a section is very simple. You start by clicking once, and then you move your cursor along one of the guidelines. Clicking a second time or pressing the Enter key is what ends the drawing of that section. Now, we're going to talk more about these later, but you'll also notice that you can draw off at different angles here. Okay, so just a quick introduction. If I needed to make a 45-degree turn here, in other words, a 45-degree elbow would be inserted, I would click 45, and you can see that I now have guidelines that allow me to move off. Now, if I don't want to go the strict straight up, down, left, or right at a 45-degree angle, I can click 45 a second time, and I get a protractor that allows me to choose the angle at which I'm going to shoot off. But as I said, we'll start that a little bit more in detail later. Right now, I'm going to cancel this drawing by simply right-clicking. That's right. Anytime you start a drawing operation, if you've decided that you don't want to continue, simply right-click and that cancels what you've started. Well, now that you're drawing duct, like I said, you can draw rudimentary systems as long as they all contain 90-degree turns, and you can probably now figure out how to make the 45s and the 30-degree turns as well. Just remember, keep your eye on the flow direction, and we'll talk later. Thanks.